The room was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel like thunder. A single spotlight hummed to life, cutting through the smoky air of a modest country fair stage in Tupelo, Mississippi. And there, barefoot and trembling, stood a boy who seemed far too small for the microphone towering before him. His clothes were plain, a faded shirt and patched shorts that spoke of a life where money was scarce but dreams were limitless. His wide eyes shimmered with fear, yet somewhere deep within them flickered a spark of something untamed, something waiting to be set free. That boy was Elvis Presley. He was only 10 years old, and he had no idea that this terrifying moment, this fragile collision of fear and music, would be the first step toward changing history forever. Before we go deeper into this untold story, I want to invite you to join us on this journey into the life of the king of rock and roll. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, share it with friends who believe in the power of music, and don't forget to leave a comment. Tell us how Elvis Presley's story touches you, because his journey is not just music history, it's a human story of triumph, fear, and destiny. The Tupelo Fair in 1945 was a place of dust and laughter, of hand-cranked rides and sticky fingers holding cotton candy. Families gathered beneath banners strung with fading paint, the scent of popcorn and fried dough hanging in the warm southern air. On that particular day, the air was thick with anticipation. A local talent show was about to begin, and nobody in that crowd could have guessed they were about to witness the fragile birth of a legend. Young Elvis Presley clutched the microphone with both hands as though it might float away if he didn't hold tight enough. He wasn't the picture of confidence, far from it. His knees wobbled, his lips trembled, and every inch of his body seemed to want to run off that stage. He was terrified. But the crowd waited. The spotlight didn't dim. And so, with a shaky breath, the boy opened his mouth. The first note that spilled into the air wasn't polished. It wasn't the deep, commanding voice the world would one day know. But it was real. It was raw. And it was honest. That honesty hit the audience like a spark in dry grass. Something about the boy's fragile courage, his barefoot stance on a stage too big for him, moved people in ways they didn't understand. He sang not because he was ready but because something inside him demanded to be heard. That day, Elvis didn't win the contest. He finished 5th. Just another kid among many, overlooked by the judges. But the story didn't end with the ribbon he didn't take home. The true prize was the way he felt as the last note left his lips, the way the world seemed to shift beneath his feet. For Elvis Presley, this was not a failure. This was ignition. This was the moment when fear met destiny. To understand the weight of that moment, you must picture the world Elvis came from. Born in a two-room house in Tupelo, life for Elvis was never easy. His parents, Vernon and Gladys Presley, worked tirelessly just to keep food on the table. Money was scarce, but love was not. Gladys, especially, poured every ounce of tenderness into her boy, and it was her lullabies and gospel hymns in the church that first wrapped Elvis in the comfort of music. He was a child of the South, raised on the crossroads of gospel, country, and blues, a melting pot of sound that would one day explode into something the world had never heard before. But in 1945, Elvis was just a shy boy with a dream he didn't yet know how to name. Standing barefoot on that stage was like staring down a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. Yet even in the trembling of his small voice, something unshakable was born. Those who were there that day would never forget the strange magic of that skinny kid with the big eyes. The crowd didn't see it then, but history had just been nudged in a new direction. The untold story of Elvis Presley's first performance is not about success. It's about fear. It's about how greatness is often born in the most fragile, trembling moments when a person could so easily walk away. Imagine if Elvis had chosen silence. Imagine if he had stepped off that stage, humiliated by fear, and never tried again. The world would never have known the king of rock and roll. Years later, when Elvis Presley filled stadiums with screaming fans and cameras flashed against his glittering suits, it was impossible to imagine that he had once been the terrified boy on a wooden stage. But that is what makes this story so powerful. Every legend begins with doubt. Every king begins as a child. And Elvis, in all his later glory, never forgot where he came from. the scene of that first performance plays like a film reel lost to time. The dusty fairground. The rustle of the crowd. The hot Mississippi sun dipping low in the sky. Elvis's small voice breaking through the stillness. There were no fireworks, no thunderous applause, no record contracts waiting backstage. Just a boy and his song. Yet sometimes, it is in the smallest of moments that the seeds of destiny are planted. The years that followed would transform Elvis from a shy boy to a cultural icon. By the time he was a teenager, he was already soaking in the sounds of Beale Street in Memphis, absorbing blues, gospel, and country until they fused into something electric. That early mixture of influences became the foundation of what the world would come to call rock and roll. But beneath the swagger, beneath the fame, there was always the memory of that barefoot boy and his trembling first step into the light. The untold story of Elvis Presley isn't just about music, it's about humanity. It's about a boy who was terrified but chose to sing anyway. It's about the way small choices ripple outward to change the world. That first performance didn't crown him a star, but it gave him something more important, the courage to keep going. And that courage carried him through the highs of superstardom and the lows of loneliness. For the audience in Tupelo, that night was nothing more than a county fair memory. But for the world, it was the start of a revolution. Because one day, that same boy would electrify stages from Las Vegas to Honolulu. He would break barriers, scandalize audiences, and redefine what music could be. He would become Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. And all of it began barefoot, terrified, and trembling at a small-town fair. Think about your own fears, your own stages. How many times have you stood trembling, afraid to take the first step? Elvis's story is proof that greatness doesn't start with confidence. It starts with fear. It starts with a voice that shakes but chooses to be heard anyway. That is the untold story we must remember, and so, when we look back on that night in 1945, we don't see a scared little boy anymore. We see the spark of history, the fragile beginning of a flame that would burn across the world. We see the king of rock and roll in his rawest form, not yet crowned, not yet confident, but already destined. This is the story of Elvis Presley's first performance. A story not about winning, but about beginning. A story about how the greatest journeys often start barefoot, terrified, and against all odds. And in that truth lies the lesson Elvis leaves us. That courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to sing through it. Elvis once said, "When I was a child, I never thought I'd be anybody important." And yet, standing barefoot on that stage in Tupelo, history quietly began to prove him wrong. So let this story stay with you. Let it remind you that even the king of rock and roll began as a trembling boy with nothing but a song. And when your own stage lights shine, and fear grips your throat, remember Elvis. Remember that history changes when we choose to sing anyway. But the story of Elvis Presley's first performance doesn't simply end with a trembling boy stepping off stage into the thick Mississippi dusk. No, that was only the prologue, the opening chord to a symphony that would thunder across decades, reshaping the soundscape of the 20th century. What followed after that moment was not an easy road. It was not a straight path to glory. It was a winding, often lonely journey, and each step carried the echo of that boyish voice, barefoot and fragile, daring to be heard. In the days after the Tupelo Fair, Elvis went back to the rhythm of ordinary life. He returned to the poverty that wrapped around his family like a second skin. His home was small, the walls thin, and the nights heavy with the sound of his parents' whispered worries about bills and work. Yet music was always there. It poured out of church pews on Sunday mornings, where Elvis sat wide-eyed, transfixed by the gospel harmonies that filled the air with something greater than words. It drifted from the radios of neighbors, carrying blues, country ballads, and the aching drawl of voices that seemed to speak straight to the soul. The memory of that first performance clung to him, not as a humiliation, but as a kind of private promise. He knew what it felt like to stand before an audience, even terrified. And once you taste that fire, no matter how small, it changes you. Something deep inside Elvis Presley wanted to chase that feeling again, not the fear, but the freedom that followed when the song left his lips. By his teenage years, Elvis was already standing on the edge of a new world. Moving with his family to Memphis exposed him to a melting pot of sounds and cultures. He wandered down Beale Street, ears wide open, drinking in the blues rhythms pouring from clubs, marveling at the way music could be both raw and transcendent. He bought cheap records, played them until the grooves wore thin, and practiced guitar in his bedroom until his fingers ached. Every strum, every lyric, carried with it the weight of that little boy who once shook before a microphone. He was still afraid sometimes, but fear had become the companion that pushed him forward. The untold story of Elvis Presley is this: he was never meant to be ordinary. But the extraordinary did not reveal itself all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, through failed auditions, through nights spent questioning if he was good enough, through moments when the world seemed unwilling to open its doors. The king of rock and roll was not crowned overnight. He was forged in the quiet fires of persistence, in the decision to sing again and again, no matter how many times the world tried not to listen. What makes that first performance in Tupelo so haunting is that it stands as the blueprint for everything Elvis would later embody. The fear. The trembling. The choice to go on anyway. Decades later, when he stood in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans, sequins glittering under blinding stage lights, the boy was still there. Beneath the swagger and the power, Elvis Presley carried the memory of that barefoot child who first discovered that music could save him. Imagine the weight of that knowledge. To know that every note you sing, every song you pour into the microphone, carries not just sound but a story that began when you were 10 years old. That story never left him. It colored the way he moved, the way he performed, the way he reached out and touched the hearts of millions. When Elvis curled his lip, when he shook his hips in defiance of every conservative hand-wringing in America, he wasn't just entertaining, he was reliving the courage it took to face down that first spotlight, for the fans who would one day faint at the mere sound of his voice, who would camp outside venues just for a glimpse of his shadow. The idea of Elvis as a terrified boy is almost unthinkable. But it is precisely that image, the fragile child, trembling yet singing, that makes his story so timeless. Because it tells us that greatness is not reserved for the fearless. It belongs to those who sing despite their fear. As the years rolled on, Elvis became something larger than life, a symbol, a myth, a phenomenon that could not be contained. He became the king of rock and roll, the name itself echoing with power. But every crown carries its weight, and Elvis bore his quietly. Off stage, he remained deeply human. He laughed, he hurt, he loved, and he longed for connection. And in his quietest moments, perhaps, he remembered that fairground stage, the dust, the crowd, the silence before the first note. That was his beginning, and beginnings have a way of shaping everything that follows. There is a reason we tell this story today. It isn't just nostalgia. It isn't just the desire to paint Elvis Presley as more than an icon. It's because this untold story reminds us of something essential about life. We live in a world that celebrates victories, crowns, and headlines. But Elvis's story shows us that what truly shapes us are the moments when no one is watching, when the outcome is uncertain, when we are most afraid. That is where courage is born. That is where history quietly begins to shift. Picture it again, a boy on a wooden stage, barefoot, clutching a microphone like a lifeline. His voice is small, but it carries. It carries not only across the fairground but across time, across generations, across the entire world. That single act of courage became the seed from which an empire of music and memory would grow. It is a reminder that even the king of rock and roll began in the humblest of ways, and so we return to that moment in 1945, not as an isolated story but as the heartbeat of a legend. Every note Elvis ever sang, from Heartbreak Hotel to Suspicious Minds, carries the echo of that first trembling voice. Every fan who ever screamed his name owes their joy to the boy who refused to let fear silence him. Every time his name is spoken, Elvis Presley, the world is unknowingly honoring that barefoot child. This is more than music history. This is the untold story. The boy who would be king did not win his first contest, but he won something greater, the courage to take the stage again. And that courage is what changed history. So let us not forget that legends are born not in moments of triumph but in moments of trembling. Elvis Presley became the king of rock and roll because he dared to sing when it would have been easier to stay silent. His story is our story, too, a story about fear, about courage, and about the way a single moment can ripple outward to change the world. And now, dear reader, the story is in your hands. If this journey through Elvis's first performance and beyond has touched you, let it live on. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that peel back the curtain on the legends we think we know. Like this video to keep Elvis's flame alive. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that fear does not end a story, it begins one. And comment below to tell us how Elvis Presley has shaped your life, your music, your understanding of courage, because Elvis's first performance is not just about a boy on a stage in Tupelo. It is about the way one trembling voice can echo forever. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it now. If you felt moved by this story, if Elvis Presley's journey has touched your heart the way it has touched millions across generations, then I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories, like this one that bring history to life. Like this video to show your support for keeping Elvis's legacy alive. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of what courage looks like. And leave a comment below, tell us what Elvis Presley means to you, tell us your favorite memory of the king of rock and roll, tell us how music has changed your life, because in the end, Elvis's story is not just about him. It is about us. It is about the way one trembling voice can inspire the world. And that, dear reader, is how a barefoot boy in Tupelo changed history.